Good morning. This is Ron. It is March 25th, Sunday. Welcome to Story Time. This morning, Chapter 12 of Philosophy Who Needs It, Egalitarianism and Inflation. The classic example of a vicious irresponsibility is the story of the Emperor Nero, who fiddled or sang poetry while Rome burned. An example of similar behavior may be seen today in a less dramatic form. There is nothing imperial about the actors. They're not one single bloated monster, but a swarm of undernourished professors. There's nothing resembling poetry, even bad poetry, in the sounds they make, except for pretentiousness. But they are prancing around the fire and, while chanting that they want to help, are pouring paper refuse on the flames. They are those amorphous intellectuals who are preaching egalitarianism to a leaderless country on the brink of an unprecedented disaster. Egalitarianism is so evil and so silly a doctrine that it deserves no serious study or discussion. But that doctrine has a certain diagnostic value. It is the open confession of the hidden disease that has been eating away at the insides of civilization for 2 centuries or longer under many disguises and cover-ups. Like the half-witted member of a family struggling to preserve a reputable front, egalitarianism has escaped from a dark closet and is screaming to the world that the motive of its compassionate, humanitarian, altruistic, collectivist brothers is not the desire to help the poor, but to destroy the competent. The motive is hatred of the good for being the good, a hatred focused specifically on the fountainhead of all goods, spiritual or material, the men of ability. The mental process underlying the egalitarians' hope to achieve their goal consists of 3 steps. They believe that that which they refuse to identify does not exist. Number 2, therefore human ability does not exist. And 3, therefore they are free to devise social schemes which would obliterate this non-existent. Of special significance to the present discussion is the egalitarians' defiance of the law of causality, their demand for equal results from unequal causes or equal rewards for unequal performance. As an example, I should quote from a review by Bennett M. Berger, professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego. The New York Times Book Review, January 6, 1974. The review discusses a book entitled More Equality by Herbert Gans. I have not read and do not intend to read that book. It is the reviewer's own notions that are particularly interesting and revealing. Herbert Gans, quote, makes it clear from the start, unquote, writes Mr. Berger, quote, that he's not talking about equality of opportunity, which almost nobody seems to be against anymore, but about equality of results, what used to be called equality of condition. What he cares most about is reducing inequalities of income, wealth, and political power. More equality could be achieved, according to Gans, by income redistribution, mostly through a version of the credit income tax, and by decentralization of power, ranging from more equality in hierarchical organizations, e.g., corporations and universities, to a kind of community control that would provide those minorities most victimized by inequality some insulation against being consistently outvoted by the relatively affluent majorities of the larger political constituencies. If being consistently voted is a social injustice, what about big businessmen, who are the smallest minority and would always be consistently outvoted by other groups? Mr. Berger does not say. But since he consistently equates economic power with political power and seems to believe that money can buy anything, one can guess what his answer would be. And in any case, he is not an admirer of democracy. Mr. Berger reveals some of his motivation when he describes Herbert Gans as a, quote, policy scientist, unquote, who suffers from a certain, quote, malaise, unquote. Quote, part of this malaise is a nightmare in which the policy scientist, not poorly prepared, but in full possession of the facts, reasons, and plans he needs to promote persuasively the changes he advocates, is frustrated, humiliated, defeated by congressional committees and executive staffs politically beholden to the constituencies and the patrons who keep them in office, unquote. In other words, they did not let him have his way. Lest you think it is only material wealth that Mr. Barker is out to destroy, consider the following. Quote, decentralization of power, for example, does not necessarily produce more equality. Even the direct democracy of the New England town meeting does very little to rid the local political community of the excessive influence exercised by the more educated, the more articulate, the more politically hip, unquote. This means that the educated and the ignorant, the articulate and the incoherent, the politically active and the passive or inert should have an equal influence and an equal power over everyone's life. There is only one instrument that can create an equality of this kind, a gun. Mr. Berger stresses that he agrees with Mr. Gann's egalitarian goal, but he doubts that it can be achieved by the open advocacy of more equality. And with remarkably open cynicism, Mr. Berger suggests, quote, another strategy, unquote. Quote, the advocacy of equality inevitably comes into conflict with other liberal values, such as individualism and achievement. But the advocacy of citizenship does not. And the history of democracy is a history of political struggles to win more and more rights for more and more people to bring ever larger proportions of the population to fully functioning citizenship. In the 20th century, there have been struggles to remove racial and sexual impediments, to win rights to decent housing, medical care, education, all on the grounds not of equality, but on the grounds that they are necessary conditions for citizens equal by definition to exercise their responsibility to govern themselves. Who knows what rights lie over the horizon? Right to orgasm, to feel beautiful. I think those will make people better citizens, unquote. In other words, he suggests that egalitarian goals can be achieved by blowing up the term citizenship into a totalitarian concept, i.e., a concept embracing all of life. If Mr. Berger is that open in advising the setting up of an ideological booby trap, who are the boobs he expects to catch? The underendowed, the general public, or the intellectuals whom he tempts with such bait as, quote, a right to orgasm, unquote, in exchange for forgetting individualism and achievement? I hope your guess is as good as mine. I will not argue against egalitarian doctrines by defending individualism, achievement, and the men of ability. Not after writing Atlas Shrugged. I will let reality speak for me. It usually does. Under the heading of, quote, Allende's legacy, unquote, in an article, the Wall Street Journal, April 19, 1974, offers some concrete, real-life examples of what happens when income, wealth, and power are distributed equally among all men, regardless of their competence, character, knowledge, achievement, or brains. Quote, by the time the military acted to overthrow the Allende government, prices had soared to more than 1,000% in 2 years and were climbing at the rate of 3% a day at the very end. The national treasury was practically empty, unquote. The socialist government had seized a number of American-owned industrial firms. The new military government invited the American managements to come back. Most of them accepted. Among them was the Dow Chemical Company, which owned a plastics plant in Chile. Bob G. Caldwell, Dow's Director of Operations for South America, came with a technical team to inspect the remains of their plant. Quote, what we found was unbelievable to us, he recalls. The plant was still operable, but in another 6 months we wouldn't have had any plant at all. They never checked anything. We found valves that hadn't been maintained, leaking corrosive chemicals that would have eventually eaten away practically everything. Worse yet, the highly inflammable chemicals handled at the plant were in imminent danger of blowing up. Safety went to pot, Mr. Caldwell says. The fire sprinkler system was disconnected and the valves taken away for some other use outside. Then they were smoking in the most dangerous areas. They told us, you didn't have any fires while you were here before, so it must not be as dangerous as you said, unquote. I submit that the mentality represented by this last sentence, a mentality capable of functioning in this manner, is the loathsomely evil root of all human evils. Apparently, some mentalities in the new Chilean government belong to the same category. They have the same range and scope, but the consequences of their actions are not so immediately perceivable, though not much farther away. In order to avoid labor disputes, the new government has frozen all labor contracts in form and on the terms established under the Allende regime. For example, the Dow Company's contract includes a quote requirement that all the plant's plastic scrap be given to the union, which then sells it. Quote, we hope to get that one overturned, a company official says, because it's a clear incentive to produce almost nothing but scrap. Then there is the case of a big Santiago textile firm. In contract with 1,300 workers, its contract with 1,300 workers virtually guarantees bankruptcy. The textile firm's employees get a certain amount of cloth free as a part of their wages and can buy unlimited quantities at a 37% discount. At those prices, the firm loses money. Under President Allende, the workers sold the cloth on the black market at huge profits, and it was an important factor in assuring later backing for the Allende government. How long can a company or country or mankind survive under a policy of this sort? Most people do not see the answer, but some do. Material shortages are the consequence of another, much more profound shortage, which is created by egalitarian governments and ignored by the public until it is too late. Quote, Chile's experiment with Marxism has also left the country with a shortage of engineers and technicians that could reach serious proportions. Thousands of them left during the Allende regime. Despite incentives offered by the junta, they haven't been coming back, and many more key people continue to leave for higher paying jobs abroad. Here in Chile, says a business executive, we must get used to the fact that good people must be paid well, unquote. But here in the United States, we are told to get used to the idea that they must not. There's no such thing as, quote, good people, unquote, cries Professor Berger, or Professor Gans, or Professor Rawls, and if some are good, it's because they're exploiting those who aren't. There's no such thing as, quote, key people, unquote, says Professor Berger. We're all equal by definition. No, says Professor Rawls, some were born with unfair advantages, such as intelligence, and should be made to atone for it to those who weren't. We want more equality, says Professor Gans, so those who devise sprinkler systems and those who smoke around inflammable chemicals would have equal pay, equal influence, and an equal voice in the community control of science and production. The term brain drain is known the world over. It names a problem which various governments are beginning to recognize and are trying to solve by chaining the men of ability to their homelands. Yet social theoreticians see no connection between intelligence and production. The best among men are running from every corner and slave pen of the globe, running in search of freedom. Their refusal to cooperate with slave drivers is the noblest moral action they could take, and incidentally, the greatest service they could ever render mankind. But they don't know it. No voices are raised anywhere in their honor, in acknowledgement of their value and recognition of their importance. Those whose job it is to know, those who profess concern with the plight of the world, look on and say nothing. The intellectuals turn their eyes away, refusing to know. The practical men do know, but keep silent. One can't blame the dazed brutes of Chile, who swoop down on an industrial plant and cavort at black market fiesta for not understanding that the plant cannot run at a loss if their social superiors tell them that they are entitled to more equality. One can't blame savages for not understanding that everything has its price, and what they steal, seize, or extort today will be paid for by their own starvation tomorrow. If their social superiors in management offices, in university classrooms, in newspaper columns, in parliamentary halls are afraid to tell them. What are all those people counting on? If a Chilean factory goes bankrupt, the equalizers will find another factory to loot. If that other factory starts crumbling, it will get a loan from the bank. If the bank has no money, it will get a loan from the government. If the government has no money, it will get a loan from a foreign government. If no foreign government has any money, all of them will get a loan from the United States. What they don't know, and neither does this country, is that the United States is broke. Justice does not exist in the world, whether people choose to practice it or not. The men of ability are being avenged. The avenger is reality. Its weapon is slow, silent, invisible, and men perceive it only by its consequences, by the gutted ruins and the moans of agony it leaves in its wake. The name of the weapon is inflation. Inflation is a man-made scourge, made possible by the fact that most men do not understand it. It is a crime committed on so large a scale that its size is its protection. The integrating capacity of the victim's minds breaks down before the magnitude and the seeming complexity of the crime, which permits it to be committed openly, in public. For centuries, inflation has been wrecking one country after another, yet men learn nothing, offer no resistance, and perish. Not like animals driven to the slaughter, but worse, like animals stampeding in search of a butcher. If I told you that the precondition of inflation is psychoepistemological, that inflation is hidden under perceptual illusions created by broken conceptual links, you would not understand me. That is what I propose to explain and to prove. Let us start at the beginning. Observe the fact that, as a human being, you are compelled by nature to eat at least once a day. In a modern American city, this is not a major problem. You can carry your sustenance in your pocket in the form of a few coins. You can give it no thought, you can skip meals, and when you're hungry, you can grab a sandwich or open a can of food, which you believe will always be there. But project what the necessity to eat would mean in nature, i.e., if you are alone in a primeval wilderness. Hunger, nature's ultimatum, would make demands on you daily, but the satisfaction of the demands would not be available immediately. That satisfaction takes time and tools. It takes time to hunt and to make your weapons. You have other needs as well. You need clothing. It takes time to kill a leopard to get its skin. You need shelter. It takes time to build a hut, and food to sustain you while you're building it. The satisfaction of your daily physical needs would absorb all your time. Observe that time is the price of your survival, and that it has to be paid in advance. Would it make any difference if there were 10 of you instead of one? If there were 100 of you, 1,000, 100,000? Do not let the numbers confuse you. In regard to nature, the facts will remain inexorably the same. Socially, the large numbers may enable some men to enslave others and to live without effort, but unless a sufficient number of men are able to hunt, all of you will perish, and so will your rulers. The issue becomes much clearer when you discover agriculture. You can survive more safely and comfortably by planting seeds and collecting a harvest months later, on condition you comply with two absolutes of nature. You must save enough of your harvest to feed you until the next harvest, and, above all, you must save enough seeds to plant your next harvest. You may run short on your own food, you may have to skimp and go half hungry, but under penalty of death, you do not touch your stock seed. If you do, you're through. Agriculture is the first step towards civilization because it requires a significant advance in men's conceptual development. It requires that they grasp two cardinal concepts which the perceptual, concrete-bound mentality of the hunters could not grasp fully: time and savings. Once you grasp these, you have grasped the three essentials of human survival: time, savings, production. You've grasped the fact that production is not a matter confined to the immediate moment, but a continuous process, and that production is fueled by previous production. The concept of stock seed unites the three essentials and applies not merely to agriculture, but much, much more widely to all forms of productive work. Anything above the level of a savage's precarious, hand-to-mouth existence requires savings. Savings by time. If you live on a self-sustaining farm, you save your grain. You need the saved harvest of your good years to carry you through the bad ones. You need your saved seed to expand your production, to plant a larger field. The safer your supply of food, the more time it buys for upkeep or improvement of other things you need: your clothing, your shelter, your water well. your livestock, and, above all, your tools, such as your plow. You can make a gigantic step forward when you discover that you can trade with other farmers, which leads you all to the discovery of the road to an advanced civilization, the division of labor. Let us say that there are 100 of you. Each learns to specialize in the production of some goods needed by all, and you trade your products by direct barter. All of you become more expert at your tasks, therefore more productive, therefore your time brings you better returns. On a self-sustaining farm, your savings consisted mainly of stored grain and foodstuffs, but grain and foodstuffs are perishable and cannot be kept for long. So you ate what you could not save. Your time range was limited. Now your horizon has been pushed immeasurably farther. You don't have to expand the storage of your food. You can trade your grains for some commodity which will keep longer and which you can trade for food when you need it. But which commodity? It is thus that you arrive at the next gigantic discovery. You devise a tool of exchange: money. Money is the tool of men who have reached a high level of productivity and a long-range control over their lives. Money is not merely a tool of exchange. Much more importantly, it is a tool of saving, which permits delayed consumption and buys time for future production. To fulfill this requirement, money has to be some material commodity which is imperishable, rare, homogeneous, easily stored, not subject to wild fluctuations of value, and always in demand among those you trade with. This leads you to the decision to use gold as money. Gold money is a tangible value in itself and a token of wealth actually produced. When you accept a gold payment for your goods, you actually deliver the goods to the buyer. The transaction is as safe as simple barter. When you store your savings in the form of gold coins, they represent the goods which you have actually produced and which have gone to buy time for other producers, who will keep the productive process going so that you'll be able to trade your coins for goods any time you wish. Now, project what would happen to your community of 100 hardworking, prosperous, forward-moving people if one man were allowed to trade on your market, not by means of gold, but by means of paper, i.e., if he paid you not with material commodity, not with goods he'd actually produced, but merely with a promissory note on his future production. This man takes your goods, but does not use them to support his own production. He does not produce at all. He merely consumes the goods. Then he pays you higher prices for more goods, again in promissory notes, assuring you that he is your best customer, who expands your market. Then one day a struggling young farmer who suffered from a bad flood wants to buy some more grain from you. But your price has risen and you haven't much grain to spare, so he goes bankrupt. Then the dairy farmer to whom he owed money raises the price of milk to make up for the loss, and the truck farmer who needs the milk gave up buying eggs he had always bought, and the poultry farmer kills some of his chickens which he can't afford to feed, and the alfalfa grower, who can't afford the higher price of eggs, sells some of his stock seed and cuts down on his planting. And the dairy farmer can't afford the higher price of alfalfa, so he cancels his order to the blacksmith. And you want to buy the new plow you've been saving for, but the blacksmith has gone bankrupt. Then all of you present the promissory notes to your, quote, best customer, unquote, and you discover that they were promissory notes not on his future production, but on yours. Only you have nothing left to produce with. Your land is there, your structures are there, but there's no food to sustain you through the coming winter, and no stock seed to plant. Would it make any difference if that community consisted of 1,000 farmers, 100,000, a million, 211 million, the entire globe? No matter how widely you spread the blight, no matter what variety of products and what incalculable complexity of deals become involved, this, dear readers, is the cause, the pattern, and the outcome of inflation. And that's the end of part 1 of chapter 12 of Philosophy Who Needs It, Egalitarianism and Inflation. And one of the things that I wanted to note about this particular chapter is that it was written in 1974. And so she was talking about the country sitting on the edge of a big disaster. And a lot of her articles go through that, where they say that the country and the world is going to hell in a handbasket. It's on the verge of collapse economically and otherwise. And yet, here we are, how many decades later? And the world is still going, and the United States is still going. And yet, we hear today people saying the same things Ayn Rand was saying back in 1974. The country's going to hell in a handbasket. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. We're all going to be paying the price pretty soon. Everything is going to collapse. This is unsustainable, blah, 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 blah. And yet here we are. Now, is inflation a real thing? Yes, it is. We don't currently have much in the way of inflation in the current time, but I remember growing up during a period of inflation in the 1970s, and people used to sport buttons on their shirts that said "Win," which stood for "Whip Inflation Now." And so my point on this is that Ayn Rand has asserted in her writings, and you'll hear about them later, that this is a benevolent universe and that success is to be expected. And yet, she contradicts herself so many times with this doomsday prophecy and doomsday prophecies, as a matter of fact. And that hurts her integrity, her intellectual integrity. It hurts her credibility, and it hurts her influence. Ayn Rand was a brilliant woman, a genius, but she was not as influential as she could have been or should have been. And the reason is because of her credibility. She did not have a maximum amount of credibility and a maximum amount of integrity. And one of the worst things that you can do for your integrity is contradict yourself. Say one thing at one time and then act or say the direct opposite some other time. And again, Ayn Rand has basically come out and said that it is by the evidence of our senses a benevolent universe. She's right. She's absolutely right about that. But then she cannot come around and say, oh, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. Doom is right around the corner. Get ready to stick your head in the oven, cut your wrists or whatever, because everything is going to be a disaster pretty soon. You can't have it both ways. It's one or the other. If success is to be expected, then what it means is that despite inflation, despite the mistakes that we make, intellectual, philosophical, cultural, and otherwise, we will find a way to continue to prosper. We will find a way to maybe not. We may endure some significant setbacks. We may end up having, yes, a very high inflation rate. We may end up having to all kinds of other interesting issues and problems that are associated with inflation or that have nothing to do with inflation. But we will overcome them. One of the reasons that we have an inflationary economy worldwide is because of something called Keynesian economics. It was designed, Keynesian economics, deliberately as an inflationary system. The whole idea comes from Herbert Crowley, who was considered the father of the, quote, progressive, unquote, movement in this country, grandfather. And he was saying that there's a promise to American life, and that promise is ever increasing prosperity. He was a critic of the economy in which he grew up in, which he referred to as boom and bust. That the economy would be going great gangbusters, and then all of a sudden we would find ourselves in a deep recession or even a depression. And then it would go boom again, then it would go bust again, etc., that kind of thing. And he was saying, fictionally, because there is no such thing as a promise to American life. There may very well be an American dream, but there is no promise to American life. But he claims that the promise is that my children will do better than I will, their children will do better than they, etc., etc. And that in a boom and bust economy, that's not possible. So therefore, the economy has to be put into the hands, and the economy in his day was more market-oriented. The individual had more say in market activities than they do today. And that's what he was suggesting, Herbert Crowley, that the government should take over the reins of the economy and smooth out these peaks and valleys so that, again, we have ever increasing prosperity and we don't have any depressions, recessions, etc. And so along comes Mr. Keynes. I think he was a knight. But anyways, I can't remember his first name in any case. But Keynes then created this economic system, an inflationary economic system. We get off the gold standard, we produce paper, and the idea is that whenever the economy, no matter which way the economy goes, the government's in charge of making sure it stays, everything stays relatively good. If it gets too hot, things start to get a little bit too hot, the government takes steps and measures to try to cool it off. And it's usually with money, by how much money they're going to loan and that type of thing. And because if the economy gets too hot, that's when, again, you're getting inflation. And so the government is printing money instead of having gold as your the basic value. It's just the government printing money, and then if we do start to slide a little bit, the economy starts to go backwards a little bit, the government prints more money, spends more money, and then the idea is that that's going to smooth out the economy and get rid of, again, the peaks and valleys that is the norm, or seem to be the norm of economic activity in this country. The problem, of course, with the Keynesian economics is it's a failure. We've had recession, 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 and I would argue we've probably even had one or two depressions along the way. And every time we have a recession, it's another slap in the face to John Maynard Keynes and his theory. And by the way, people had asked Keynes about, okay, well, if you're going to create this inflationary economy and all this paper and things are going to be relatively valueless, what happens in the long run? And his answer was, well, in the long run, we're all dead. How about that? So, anyways, yeah, that's the whole idea behind inflation. And if we want to get rid of an inflationary economy, and I assume that eventually we're going to get back to that, is we have to move to a gold standard economy. Now, Ayn Rand has mentioned that we've never really been on a full gold standard. We've had our paper money backed by gold at certain periods in our history. And so it looks to me like we'll either have to maybe go back to that first, but eventually I'd like to see the country, and I think what's best for everybody is that the country go back to a gold standard economy. Get rid of inflation, plus you also get other benefits from having a gold standard economy, such as fewer wars. Because the way countries are able to finance wars, and now since we don't actually declare war anymore, we just have military operations in various places, but governments finance them with loans, with inflating the money supply in order to be able to pay for all the weapons and people that they need to prosecute the wars. On a gold standard economy, the government would be kept in check by the fact that we're on a gold standard economy. They cannot go out and print money for foreign military escapades, and so again would be kept in check. But again, that's the end of that part one of this particular chapter, egalitarianism and inflation. And coming up on, I'm going to be guessing, well, either tomorrow or Tuesday will be part two of this particular chapter. So until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.